across America, starting at...
In sports, 5 games were featured.
Sta veramente già entrando nel clima.
Fighting broke out overnight between...
Are you looking for a new love?
Hello there, come on down to Lennox Auto.
Yeah, woo!
Not fooling anybody.
I don't know, and I want out!
Can't walk away now.
Truth.
We want information. 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 I am not a number. I am a free man.
It's that time. Hey listeners, welcome to the PowerTank Late Night Show. I'm Shred, and although you may know me best from the Power Chord Show, I'm also over here giving you my opinion, sharing some of my interests, and trying to spread a little bit of the truth. If we can somehow sit down and figure it all out together, God knows it isn't what we're told since the day we're born. I'm a little bit grumpy tonight, just a little bit jaded, and I think I'm actually tired for once too, so this may be a short show, but I do want to give you guys another little shot of the truth, as researched by Richard Dolan. There's a lot going on out this week, and next week too, by the looks of it. If you didn't catch the blood moon earlier this week, have no fear, you'll get in a couple more chances this year. In an extremely rare event, actually, we're going to have 4 of them this year, 4 blood moons. As many of you may know, it's not really anything to get super worked up about. The moon color anyways, I wouldn't get too worked up about that, but the gravity and the tectonics from the alignment which causes it, that may be a different story. But the color of the moon, it's simply caused by the shadow of the earth blocking out the moon from direct sunlight, and instead of getting direct light to give you that nice white glow, it's just a illuminated reflection of sunrise on the earth here somewhere. So speaking of tectonics, there is a bit of activity going on this planet. Remember the big 7.9 we just had that they downgraded? Had the Chilean quakes. Micronesia is now seismically active, and the Ring of Fire is lighting up in the Pacific. We're now starting to pick up some inland quakes here in the United States, particularly in the Washington State and the Idaho region, but we're also seeing increased activity around the Yellowstone caldera. It's been relatively quiet for the last 30 years, starting to get some tremors out of there right now, and a lot of people are freaking out about that. But it's my opinion, and it's not one you should probably go bet on, but it's my opinion that what we're seeing is just the earth releasing a little bit of stress through the groans and a few sharp jolts here and there. Probably not much to get worked up about. The damages and the loss of life across the planet's been relatively minor, I guess, but let's hope things start to settle down here soon. That might not be the case for long if things continue to pick up. As most of you have probably not been informed, Cliven Bundy, the Nevada cattle rancher who's been in a decades-long dispute with the federal agencies over his land his family has ranched since the 1880s, I guess it's not so much about the land, it's more about the fees they say that the Bundys owe the BLM for the grazing there, but he's apparently won the first round of the hostile takeover by government agencies. They confiscated his cattle and kicked him off the land. An alert went out, and the alert citizenry showed up, and they provided their own news coverage despite the government actually shutting down the data and the internet connections over the region, as well as the airspace over the region. That right there, I think, is probably what set more bells and whistles off, was the fact that it looked just like what you were seeing when some of these revolutions were happening overseas with this whole Arab Spring thing. Geez, it actually kind of played out exactly like it was done over there, kind of like they were working off the same page. That's a little bit of food for thought anyways, but with all the media coverage provided by people, because the media was doing a piss poor job of actually covering it, the rancher had the opportunity to negotiate a peace before the 200 militarized BLM agents armed with body armor and AR-15s had the opportunity to make good on Clark County, Nevada Commissioner Tom Collins's desire to send home anyone who supported Bundy in a body bag. If you remember, Paiute County, Utah Commissioner Darren Bushman reported the following on Facebook. He said, "I was just told by Commissioner Collins of Clark County, Nevada, that all of us folks from Utah are a bunch of, quote, inbred bastards, end quote, and if we're coming to Clark County, Nevada to support Cliven Bundy, then we had all, quote, better have funeral plans, end quote. We should, quote, turn our asses around and mind our own effing business, end quote." Now there's some classy leadership for you. He said that, not me. Personally, I've seen a little bit of this, Collins, and, if you're talking inbred, this guy's about as retarded looking as they come. Evidently he's about as intelligent as he looks too, but, the latest scuttlebutt about the issue, and it does appear to be accurate, is that the agency backed off, basically just to make the awareness of the issue fade. They didn't expect all of those people to show up in support of the issue, and, kind of figured that their whole, debacle over, their Malaysian 370 flight that just mysteriously they can't find, and all we talk about is that bullshit. Basically, I think they thought everybody'd be paying attention to that, not really paying attention to what was going on with Bundy, but it's kind of expected, and a lot of insiders are talking about it, but it's expected that they're going to return soon because that no-fly zone over the region is still active up until the 26th, I believe, and they're going to make a raid on Bundy and his family yet. I'm pretty confident about that, and several insiders have stated that they don't believe the agency will take the mud on their face very lightly, and any raid on the Bundy family is most likely going to end up with Cliven dead, few other family members most likely, and the raid, if that's what you want to call it, in fact going to be more of a hit than an arrest attempt. We'll have to keep an eye on that one, folks. It's a tinderbox that could spark something far more disastrous than anyone imagines, so don't let your breath out on that one yet if you've been following it, and if you haven't been following it, you should probably take a look into it. If you're catching this from overseas, it's well worth you guys paying attention to it too. You're going to see a little bit of your old history coming up in our new history that we're making nowadays, so definitely keep an eye on it. And that missing Malaysia airline anyways, it's still missing. The search teams are running around like chickens looking for their head, and it doesn't appear that the airliner's ever going to be found. The batteries on the locator beacon will have been dead by now, exhausted. They only had about a 30-day limit on it, and with nothing but wild goose chases to show for the effort, it looks more and more likely that the aircraft has a bit more than the standard missing aircraft story behind it. Wild speculation about the aircraft plasters the media, and then obvious reasons now we know, and all the while, Fukushima, the reactor that melted down with the quake over there in Japan, is still out of control and spewing a massive cloud of radiation into the Pacific Ocean. Pretty much all of the northern hemisphere of the Pacific Ocean is now poisoned, and the rads are now pushed up firmly against the North American west coast. The story is that there is no story. No one is working to stop it. No one's doing shit. No one's warning the public. Most Americans are unaware that their coast and their aquatic food supply is now unfit for humans. Dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico are now showing sickness, and already the mutated fish species are being found in the commercial fishing market. So, well, not on the market, but they're being found within the industry. It looks like it's so far gone now, folks, that you'd better get wise on how to protect yourself. We're in a new age of living with radiation, and the new age that the establishment has promised for decades has arrived, and it looks like it's one of sickness, radiation exposure, invasive totalitarian censorship and spying, and socialized government for the Americas. Can you say, yes, we can? Just because we can doesn't mean we should, dumbasses. And why the hell are we using nuclear plants anyways? Nuclear power plants. Einstein himself said on the topic of nuclear reactors for power, quote, "It's a hell of a way to boil some water." Y'all might not know this, but all a nuclear reactor does is boil water for a steam turbine. That's it. So, instead of boiling it with the same fuel we burn billions of other places and ways, or boiling it with solar, or boiling it with geothermal, we pick the most dangerous, if it goes wrong, most dangerous and ridiculous way to boil water. All of our brains and technology, and the best we can do with it, is essentially the exact same thing that a caveman could have done with it. We boil water. Give me a break. All right. Before I just get downright pissy about things, I'm going to cut myself off here. I'm going to roll some tape here and just let you have it. Tonight's feed, a little food for thought as you drift off to sleep. This one is on the topic of the United States secret space program and the factual existence of a breakaway civilization which exists parallel to ours in the same space with your money, but you and I will never be a part of it under the current embargo of truth from the people. From Amsterdam, this is Richard Dolan.
Richard Dolan.
Wow, thank you so much, Amsterdam. All the wonderful Nederlander and all the other people from other countries. Thank you for being here. I'm so thrilled to be here. I really think that all of us should acknowledge the hard work of Jeroen van Straten, who's organized this fabulous conference. Can we give him a round of applause, please? He certainly deserves it. David Turley, who's done the video, and all of the other people who I really think have put so much effort into putting this wonderful, wonderful conference together. During the break, one of my Facebook peeps who's here, I've got a few of them out there, came up to me and said, do you realize that this place is in the center of, it's called Sun Square. Did I get that right? Sun Square? Yeah. And there's all of these astronomical, there's Orion Square, I'm told, and all of these. So we're in the middle of it right here. We've got really the ideal location for doing what we are going to be doing today. And I'm very thrilled to see the attendance and so many, you know, as I often see at these conferences, so many brilliant, insightful people. And I always feel every single time that I learn so much more from you than you could possibly learn from me, but I will do my best to even the score. And the other thing, I've really have appreciated all of the lectures here. Peter Levenda, Timothy Good, I've known for many years. And of course Richard Hoagland, who one never wants to follow for so many reasons. I mean, the man is just a machine. He's so good. And it was really a fabulous lecture, I must say. But I've got a few things in store for you today, and I hope that we can all make a nice adventure of it together. So this is a fairly new lecture. Actually, it's almost a completely new lecture. I've been working certain themes. I work a theme for a certain period of time, and it seems to evolve. And then I move on and try something else. For the past few years, long before I co-wrote the book After Disclosure, The People's Guide to Life After Contact, I've been thinking a lot about how a disclosure might actually come about and the difficulties. And in fact, I got into all of this because I was very, very unhappy with so much disclosure talk that I'd encountered in the field of UFOs. I thought a lot of it was kind of, I don't know, utopian maybe, and not as well thought through. And I'm not trying to criticize other people. It's hard to think about this. And I discovered just how hard it was when my co-author of AD After Disclosure and I, Bryce Zabel, tried to write it. It was a real adventure trying to write that book. So I'll be talking a little bit about those themes, but really what I have in store for tonight is something a little bit different still. Some things that I've never really gone into in a great deal of detail. Dealing with what I am convinced is a bona fide secret space program. Not being in said secret space program, I can't tell you everything about it, but I have some pretty good ideas on why I think it's absolutely here. And moreover, why it is necessary for the point of view for those people running it. And then I want to talk a little bit about a theory that I've been working for a little while now, something I've come to call a breakaway civilization, and what exactly I mean by that. We'll get to that. So let's get started here. You know, whenever I deal with people who are untried in this field, and there's so many, people who think, what's the big deal about what you study? Isn't that kind of crazy? There's no proof. There's no evidence. What are these UFOs? What's the problem? Well, you know, I come back over and over to a basic fundamental point. Rather than argue what is behind this phenomenon, because we really can have different opinions on this, different theories, at least when we're dealing with the mainstream world, it's sometimes very helpful for us to remind ourselves of the fundamentals. And the real fundamental is that there's something that's going on that's not supposed to be going on. We can start with that. And I've got about a minute's worth of images that I think would be nice just to show you. This is a very brief history of some UFO photographs through the years. And you can see, going through the 1950s, we're in the 1960s, that's the first color photograph, 1965, 66, Provo, Utah, into Costa Rica, 71, France, 74, 1978, This is 2 photographs from Iran in 1978, pretty interesting. 1981 in British Columbia was one of my favorites. Hudson Valley, 1984, drawing of an enormous triangle. Space-based stuff, I'll get into that very soon. Gulf Breeze, I'm convinced that was totally legit. And so on. It's an Area 51 shot from 1989, the Belgian Triangle, we all know about that. It's, and this is just photographic evidence, interesting things. That's Area 51. Lady, unsuspecting photograph of a UFO. Lots of people take pictures of these things and they don't realize it. I did one myself, which you'll see in a moment. There's Mexico. Australia. He didn't see that. Hungary. New York State. Vancouver. Netherlands. That's my shot. I'll tell you about that in a minute. And we're almost done. It just, and this is really very small sampling, obviously, and there we are. Incidentally, the UFO photograph that I took is one of 3 photographs. I think this is the first time I've ever shown it publicly. I don't really know that it was a UFO, but it was the strangest thing, I'll tell you that. I was in Washington, D.C. It was in April of 2004. Right after the very first X conference in the D.C. area. In fact, Richard Hoagland and I both were speakers at that event. And in the aftermath of that, I did some touristy things in D.C. for a couple of days. So I took a tourist picture of one federal building at a U.S. flag, an American flag that was flowing, and I was unhappy with the breeze because the flag wasn't flowing the right way. So I took 3 pictures in the space of 60 seconds. And I didn't really notice anything, of course, until I took it home, looked at it on my screen, and I saw this crazy little speck that in all 3 photographs, because my perspective never changed, the object moved from one part of the screen, then up, and then very far away at a sharp angle. So I thought, what moves like that in the space of 60 seconds? Well, I still don't know conventionally what could have done that. But in the first image, it was at its largest, and it looked like a black, goldfish cracker, I suppose. Whatever it was, and I've shown it to a few people. No one really can identify it. Whatever it was. So that something is UFOs. That's something that's not supposed to exist. So that's some photographs, and of course, we could go on and on about that. There's really no point. There's no need to. And of course, there are countless thousands upon thousands, really millions of stories, most of them never told. It's the funny thing about this topic that at this point, I don't know how many people I've spoken to who've had UFO sightings, and I would say a large majority of them, for most of their life, don't really tell anybody. They may tell their wife or husband, or not. And it's an odd thing about it, isn't it, that many of us go through our entire lives with this most dramatic and sometimes traumatic experience that they've ever had in their life, right? And they tell no one. There's something not right about that. We're dealing with this awesome phenomenon frequently, mostly in an atomized, isolated way, in a non-coordinated way. And there's something very ominous and something very deeply wrong about that. But onward. There's not just photographs, there's not just stories, there's military documentation. A lot of it. In the United States in particular, we have some good stuff to work with. Really, by an accident of history. The roll of the dice, I'd say. And really because in the late 1970s, my country got a halfway decent, for a little while, Freedom of Information Act. It was actually worth something. That was primarily through the Carter administration, when, in fact, of all the thousands of pages of documents that we now have to work with, declassified documents, I should say, more than 50% of them were released during the Jimmy Carter administration. Think about that. Okay? Because there was an executive order by President Ronald Reagan in 1982 that severely affected the Freedom of Information Act, made it very expensive, made it very time-consuming, and just generally difficult for researchers to get more UFO documents. Exempted NORAD, for example, completely from FOIA, and much more. So, but what we have is actually not too shabby. This is maybe a top 15 or so. You could probably choose your own. I happen to like all of these. Not, again, to belabor it, there's no point. But one thing that I want to, emphasize here is that all of these documents were classified at the time that they were created. All of them. And all of them describe really extraordinary encounters. The 1947 Twining memo, very famous among most of us researchers, nevertheless bears repeating, because I'm sure there's some of you who don't know what it was. And in a brief nutshell, it comes down to this. At the time, in the September of 1947, three-star Air Force General, U.S. Air Force, Nathan Twining, who later became the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, wrote a letter in response to another general, a query by this general, about these flying saucers. Essentially, the question was, do I need to do anything about this? Is this anything that we've got that I need to deal with? And Twining wrote back this very detailed response, essentially saying, exactly saying, the reported phenomenon is real, not visionary or fictitious. That's one important point. So think, classified memo, 1947, while the Air Force and the government's telling the people there's nothing to this, it's all hallucinations and so forth. War nerves was a big one. You have in the classified world, the reality is always different, right? So you have him saying, no, it's real, it's not visionary, it is not fictitious. Well-kept formations of flights, silent, evasive maneuvers when sighted, and my personal favorite, round on top, flat on bottom. Now, what is round on top, flat on bottom in 1947? Well, officially speaking, nothing was supposed to be round on top, flat on bottom. Of course, something was. Another of my personal favorites is the 1952 CIA memo authored by the Director of Scientific Intelligence, H. Marshall Chadwell, to the Director of the CIA, Walter Bedell Smith. And this is after a very substantial wave of sightings in the U.S., so much so, military bases around the country were on alert frequently. Jet fighters or interceptor fighters were scrambled to intercept, all seemingly failed. It's an important time in the history of UFOs. And at the end of that year, in December, the Director of Scientific Intelligence writes to the Director and says, his boss, he says, sightings of unknown objects at altitudes and in the vicinity of major defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. How much more explicit are you going to get when writing a memo to your boss at the CIA in the 1950s? Well, not much. It is a bureaucracy, keep in mind, and people don't just say things like, boss, I think we're being invaded, but he might as well have said that. And on and on. There are so many of these. A lot of them are airspace violations, these documents here, that are really quite extraordinary. And they describe, again, things, nuclear missiles being switched offline. And that's happened. Weapons being switched off multiple times. The very 1976 famous Defense Intelligence Agency memo and the extraordinary event over the city of Tehran back in the days of the Shah, when Iran was a U.S. ally. In succession, 2 F-4 fighter interceptors had their key electronics instrumentation disabled by an unknown object hovering over the city at a range of 25 nautical miles. Wow. In one case, it was right before the pilot was about to fire a missile at this object. Well, the missile didn't work. And in another case, the object, the UFO, detached a smaller object, which then, this is the kicker, started intercepting one of the F-4s. So you can imagine how that pilot felt. He does an emergency turn to get away from this thing. The smaller object turned inside his own arc, according to this memo, rejoining the original craft for a perfect rejoin. Now, this isn't just hearsay. This is a detailed report that went to the President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford. It went to the Director of the CIA, George Herbert Walker Bush. And it went to the desk of Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor. Not a bad trio, and it went much more than that. So what we have, in other words, is a paper trail that's quite substantial. If you are really interested in investigating this, I took the time some years ago to write an article that I think covers this actually pretty nicely. For skeptics and believers, I called it 12 documents, not 15 in this case, but 12, proving U.S. government interest in UFOs. That's at my site at Keyhole Publishing. You can go there anytime. And I set it up so that it would be a perfect reference tool for anyone really wanting to know some of the basics as to why this topic is actually quite important and why it matters from a national security and indeed a global security perspective. So now let me move into another area of this, because all of that is really just basic introduction. And I want to talk a little bit about what I believe has happened over the years, which is retrieval of ET or technology not from our civilization. Let's put it that way. I do believe this has been happening. I think that there's very strong evidence for this. Not quite the same evidence that we get through Freedom of Information Act requests. It's a different type of evidence. I think I'll be able to explain that a little more clearly in a few minutes. But nonetheless, what we have is a lot of very suggestive, persuasive, in my view, testimony from some heavy hitters about programs to study alien, non-human technology and non-human bodies that do not originate from this world. Now, the name at the top, that's Leonard Stringfield. He was a researcher. He wasn't an insider. Back in the 1970s, Leonard Stringfield wrote a book, really the first book to reopen the whole topic of crash retrievals. He spent a couple of pages discussing this in one of his books. And as a result of that, and this is during the Carter years, a lot of people came to him quietly with amazing stories, just incredible accounts. And he collected them. He had several dozen, I think, really good stories. We have the case of Senator Barry Goldwater, longtime U.S. Senator, one-time presidential candidate, got trounced by Lyndon Johnson, but he made the Republican Party ticket. A reserve general in the U.S. Air Force and a close friend of Air Force legend General Curtis LeMay, a man who was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Barry Goldwater mentioned this story a number of times, in which he approached his friend Curtis LeMay on one occasion, asking about the so-called Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and this is where ET bodies were said to be kept. And indeed, Stringfield had gotten many such stories about this. And Goldwater, you can find this on YouTube. He's got this clip. He said, it was the only time that my friend Curtis LeMay ever cussed me out and really yelled at me and told me, don't ever ask me that again. He made it very clear that, yes, there was such a place, and you ain't going to know about it. End of story. Now think about it. This was a senator who was, to call him military friendly was an understatement. All right? He was the darling politician of the U.S. military, Republican, solid, conservative, general in the Air Force Reserve, friends with LeMay, and he could not learn about this, despite the fact that he was a prestigious U.S. senator. Dr. Robert Sarbacher, one of these defense, I call them power scientists of the 50s, a real genius, a man who was plugged in. The story of Sarbacher is a fascinating one, and there's really no need for me here to go into the details. But what ended up happening is that Sarbacher in the 1950s had a very detailed discussion with the Canadian researcher Wilbert Smith, in which he stated to Smith that, yes, the UFO... In fact, Tim Good referred to this in his lecture earlier today, but stated that this is the UFO flying saucer phenomenon is more highly classified than the H-bomb. Here's the thing. Smith ended up writing this memo to his government, Canada, in the aftermath of this. That memo wasn't found for years later, long after Smith had died. And the memo did not list Sarbacher's name. But in Smith's private papers, which were retained secretly by his family so that the Canadian government and other black op people couldn't get it, key point, because they tried, were some handwritten notes, a transcript of the conversation that he had from way back in 1950, and in that case, in those papers, Sarbacher's name was listed. And it so happened that Sarbacher was alive in the 1980s when all this came out. A few researchers found Robert Sarbacher, and guess what? This canary talked. He's talked a lot, in detail, writing, in fact, a 2-page single-space type memo confirming exactly confirming the existence of programs, of a program to study, to acquire to study crash-retrieved UFOs. And he had heard certain things about the beings that allegedly were in them. All very interesting. Eric Walker, the man on your far right, a colleague of Starbacher, a long-time president of Penn State University, but more importantly, head of one of the most prestigious defense think tanks, the Institute of Defense Analysis, which was probably for a long time at the pinnacle of the U.S. Defense think tank industry. Walker also talked a lot toward the end of his life. And then the other man, who's second from the right, is astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell. I've had many conversations with Edgar Mitchell about this topic. He's spoken publicly a few times about this as well. And he said to me personally, and he said publicly a few times, that he knew explicitly from several high-level sources. And look, when you're a Apollo 14 astronaut who's not going to want to be your friend, he's basically can talk to anyone he wants, who've talked to him explicitly about programs to study retrieved ET technology and alien bodies. And as an aside or follow-up, I will just tell you, I think it was in late 2006, I wrote to Edgar and I said, look, I've been tracking all of your statements on this, and you started talking about this at least not later than 1997. You've mentioned it several times. And look, I said, I know you've said you like my work, you support what I do. Can you help me out here? Throw me a bone. I'm not asking you to give these people these sources up, but can you give me something to work with? And because, look, all I try to do is confirm and corroborate. Having anonymous sources really doesn't quite cut it. So what we need is something to work with. But I understood the problem, of course. You've got these anonymous sources. They don't want to give themselves up. And he wrote back and said, look, I do. I get what you're doing, Rich. But the people who came to me when they did so at great professional, personal risk. And he said, he wrote, risk to their families. And I cannot give them up, not until at least after they're no longer alive. And that's exactly what he said. I've got the email. Long story short, and then Ben Rich, the man to your far left, who a couple of times has made statements. He was the head of Lockheed's Skunk Works division, certainly one of the most prestigious aerospace aviation units in the world. Made several statements toward the end of his life about very suggestive of ET reality, most particularly toward the very end of his life in 1993. He gave a lecture at the UCLA School of Engineering, an alumni chat, basically starting off as a history of Skunk Works and the stealth fighter, and back to the U-2 spy plane and so forth. But then he ended it. This is a fascinating story. He ended it on this amazing statement where he says, we now have the technology to take E.T. home. And then he said, thank you very much, and that was the end. And everyone's different. There are people who are intensely curious about the world, and there are people who do not have a curious bone in their body. So most of the people just filed out of the room after he makes this bombshell statement. Well, a few people stayed behind, surrounded him. One of these individuals is someone that I know quite well, Jan Harzan, who is an IBM executive, and he's one of the heads of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. So they're all around chatting, and Ben Rich goes into this fairly suggestive series of statements. He said, yes, we have the technology to take ET home, and it won't take a lifetime to do it, presumably a lifetime to go to the stars, he said. That's it. He said, we have the technology to go to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to do it. There are people in the black world, that is the classified world, who do not want to see this come out, even though, he said it's time that this should be segued out to the private community, and on and on and on. And then he died. So there's, and then again, there's much, much more. It, again, is not my intention to belabor this. I have other fish to fry here. There are, I talked about, anonymous leaks. What good are they? Well, they're a little bit good. I try not to use them. I try not to abuse them. Let's put it that way. The thing that happens inevitably with any researcher, I don't think there's an exception, is that once you put yourself out there, and there are people in the inside community who identify you and think, yeah, you know, I might want to work with this guy, because frankly, the classified world obviously is not monolithic, right? It's huge, it's Byzantine, it's labyrinthian. And not everyone's got the same opinion. And you've got people in there for 20, 30, 40 years. And eventually they decide, you know, really the secrecy on this is not a good thing. And so what do? Well, then they talk. They talk to a researcher that they identify. The problem, of course, though, is they can't give themselves up. They can't even give you enough information so that if it comes out, it gets traced back to them by their peers, right? We have to always keep these things in mind. So everything's vague. Everything's cloak and dagger. And it's very unsatisfactory from a researcher's point of view. And yet, let me just state that in several instances in my own experience, I've become satisfied that some of the individuals coming to me were legitimate. And this is one such case. This is actually a very famous man. And I think the day will come when I give his name. I won't right now. But I had a long conversation with him. He knows a couple of presidents of the U.S. He knows a lot of other big shots. And said to me, he said, I'm speaking to you as a scientist. I'm not speculating here. I've known factually for X number of years. He said that at deeply classified levels, he said, so classified, so compartmented, he said, you would be shocked at how secret this is. At that level, he said, there are scientists who have in their possession ET technology and at least one body that I personally know about. Those are almost his exact words. Another guy, fairly well known also, was making the rounds for a while, spoke to a 4-star general, former Joint Chiefs, who confirmed to him that there was indeed an MJ-12 type group. In other words, a controlling organization responsible for managing UFO secrecy, ET secrecy, that there was such a group, and said that it's private, primarily, and beyond standard government controls. And in fact, one of the insights that this general said to this person, this is back in the 90s, was that there seemed to be a debate along generational lines. It was the older members of this group who were the more liberal in terms of wanting to release this information. The younger ones were the hardliners, and the reason this individual was told was because the younger group had not made enough money yet off of their secret. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So we're getting to money. We're getting to private control. I'll be following up on this quite a bit in a moment. I'm a real student of American history. I love American history. When I don't read UFO material, I'm usually reading some sort of history or philosophy, and American history is pretty much at the top of my enjoyment list. I've studied the history of every single U.S. president, and it's just fascinating to me. I know that there are many Americans who are here, and you grow up in your grade school classes being taught, I call it the civics class version of history. In the States, that means I vote for my member of Congress and my senator and the president, and we've got our checks and balances. We've got the Congress and the executive branch, and don't forget the judiciary, and they all work together, and that's how government works. Kind of messy, but we get the job done. Of course, that's not how it is at all. Do we elect presidents? No. Presidents aren't elected. They're selected. And who's the guy who's in charge? Is it the president or the guy who puts him in the White House? That's a picture of David Rockefeller, in case you don't know. I would suggest to you that at least during the period of my last history book, that's volume 2 of UFOs and the National Security State, that covers from the early 1970s up to 1991, that all of the presidencies of that period, none of those guys got into office without that man nodding his head and saying, yes, he's going in. In a couple of cases, it's utterly explicit. Jimmy Carter was practically lifted up like this and dropped into the White House by Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. But all of these men, Gerald Ford also had very intimate, close relationships. So, and really, lest you doubt that U.S. policy, or really any national policy of any nation, is dominated to benefit certain elite interests, take a look at the war in Iraq right now. And it's really not my intention to go off on a rant on this. I could. but I won't. But I will point out to you that the estimate, the monetary estimate of the value of the oil in Iraq is something along the lines of $30 trillion. It's a lot of money. You know, back in the bad old days of Saddam, that oil was owned by the state of Iraq. And which meant, of course, that Saddam and his evil sons could skim and live like kings, which they did. But it also meant that that oil paid for that nation's infrastructure. Well, starting in 05, 06, 07, the fire sale of Iraqi oil began. It's all been gobbled up by multinationals now. And the real kick in the teeth, by the way, from an American taxpayer point of view, is that the companies that have bought the lion's share of oil in Iraq are not even U.S. companies. The largest one's Indonesian. There's Chinese and Turkish and so forth. And so really what you have, lest you ever doubt this, which I'm sure most of you do not, is a situation where the United States military really is little more, I would say, than the police force and the security force for international financial elites, to give them the stuff and the goods that they want, which is control over the global resources, oil, water, and on and on. And that's really what it's all about. And incidentally, I would recommend you read, if you haven't, become familiar with a great, great book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, by John Perkins from 2004. John Perkins was an economic hitman. In other words, one of these financial whiz guys working for private groups that siphon money out of various national treasuries. This is what they do. It's all about theft and money on a grand scale and control over, again, the natural resources of the world. So, okay, a little bit of background then on privatization. So let's go back to the whole concept of crash retrievals. If you, do a little thought game here. You're Harry Truman. It's 1947. And you learn that this happened. Pretend, if you don't believe it. Your top generals, your top scientists come up to you and say, "Sir, we have recovered technology that does not appear to have originated from our civilization." Wow. It's a pretty awesome piece of information. Only 2 years after the end of the greatest war in, imagination. And you're like, wow, what do I do? It's quite possible. I think it's even likely that Truman, for at least a little while, might have had this instinct to say to the world, we've got this. This is an amazing thing. But then he'd think twice. And so might you, given the context of the time. Because remember, this is in the early stages of the Cold War. Whether who was right and who was wrong, incidentally, is secondary to the fact that there is this grand competition going on. And it's one thing to tell the world that there is these other beings here. That's bad enough. But then if you've recovered an actual tangible piece of alien tech, well then, if you tell the world you've got it, it's going to become mighty hard not to share it. It's a lot easier to keep it to yourself if you just pretend this never happened. So of course that's what he would do. He would gather together around him a team of top-level advisors, people who knew their stuff, people with expertise in a variety of fields. That was important. He would say, your job is going to be to find out how bad public panic might be. Your job will be to find out how we can make use of this technology. That's important. Your job will be to find out who are these guys, do we have anything to worry about, and on and on. All the logical questions. I am certain that is what he asked. And in fact, that is what the evidence, at least in the form of those documents we call the MJ-12 documents, states. And not just those, but the mass of privately leaked documents called the Majestic documents. You can go to the website of Dr. Robert and Ryan Wood. I believe it's still Majestic documents. You can look it up. You print them all off. It's a stack of about that high. It's not just a couple of little, and they're incredibly diverse in their style, formulation, how they're put together. It's my own opinion that most of those are probably legitimate. It's my opinion. But no matter how you configure this, you're going to get a situation of runaway secrecy. You have to. Because if you don't want to tell the world that you've got this exotic technology, you have to do an end run around your formal constitutional practices. You have no choice if you want to keep this secret. And in fact, this is exactly what has happened. students, mainstream students of the black budget world, and in fact there are precious few of them anyway, really overlook the critical importance of the UFO phenomenon in the creation of the black budget world that we have today. I wouldn't say UFOs are the only contributing factor, but I would say they are very important and typically almost always overlooked. But in fact, it's the UFO secret right out of the gate in the Cold War that absolutely required the creation of an extra-legal, extra-constitutional secrecy apparatus. And so what we have are a few studies, not many, a few good studies, on the true black budget world of the United States. One from about a decade ago by aviation writer Bill Sweetman. He wasn't a UFO guy. He's an aerospace aviation guy with a very strong interest in the classified world. Estimated back then that there were about 150 special access programs, the quintessential primordial black budget programs, within the Department of Defense. He said, my own investigation tells me that there's essentially no oversight, at least from Congress, zero effective oversight. And many of these special access programs were, quote, unacknowledged, end quote. In other words, they didn't exist, except, of course, they did exist. The other thing, he noticed that their classification systems were utterly independent of each other. So if I were running one of these programs, I would decide how the secrecy actually functions. In other words, I would decide who's in, who's out. If there was a 3-star general on my team, but I didn't want him to know certain things, he doesn't know. If a friend that I grew up with, who happened to be a private contractor, and I want him in, he's in. And that's the other part. Private contractors, not Defense Department personnel, tended to dominate these in Sweetman's analysis. And he had no idea how they got their money. More recently, the Washington Post last summer came out with a multi-part series on secrecy within the U.S. intelligence community, which shocked the hell out of me because it's Washington Post, which I've always seen as one of the mainstream, one of the lackeys, really, I would have to say, for the national security apparatus of this country, but not always. Nothing is monolithic, very few things. So Dana Priest and Bill Arkin last summer write this very good series. Of course, I say very good. Really, they didn't say anything a lot different than what people like myself have been saying for many years. Essentially that the U.S. intelligence community is out of control. Essentially. You know? Massively privatized, again. No one knows how much money is pouring into this thing. They couldn't figure it out. How many people it employs? Is it making Americans any safer? Didn't seem to be. All right? So we have a system of runaway secrecy. And along those lines, I would mention, good, here we come to what I call the secrecy iceberg. There's a pretty good book that came out a year or two ago by a UK writer named Trevor Paglen called Blank Spots on the Map. And I'll bet there's some people in this room who've read it. Good book. One thing he points out is that our best estimates of the U.S. archival system tell us that probably, because really we have no way of knowing for sure, but probably it seems that more than half of all U.S. government documents are, in one form or another, classified. More than half. So to think of it this way, if you're an archivist or a historian trying to put together the history of this government, of the United States, you could argue that more than half of the history of that government is secret. That's a pretty awesome thing to state. And again, along these same lines, when we talk about approaching this topic from a scientific or an academic point of view, which is something I absolutely have always supported, nevertheless, we have to keep in mind something here. All right? It is the fundamental prerequisite of science or good academic research that everything is open. It's out there, you know. So I write a book. I've got my citations. In my second volume of history, I think I had something like 1,400 or more citations. So if you don't like what I say, you can find out where I got the information, and you can criticize it. You can disagree. No problem. If I'm doing a scientific experiment, you should be able to replicate my experiment. That's just basic. But how do you do that, really? when you are writing about a topic in which you don't and other people don't have access to all the information you need. Of course, what it means is a fundamental undermining of what we would call freedom, free inquiry. And of course, we all see that we don't have it. So we have a secrecy iceberg. Let me just go through it. If you look at the top above the water, if you want to investigate this or really any topic, you have public open sources. You have documents that were once classified but that now declassified. Within the U.S., there's a weird category which is called unclassified. And these are documents, they are available. You can find them, but you got to really hunt for them. They're not easy to find. They are unclassified, and so technically they're legal, but they may be almost impossible. They may be of a highly limited distribution, for example, and so on. And then below that, you have historically a variety of levels of secrecy. And we have confidential, and then secret, and then deeper is top secret, but it doesn't end with top secret. You've got top secret SCI, that is top secret sensitive compartmented information. That's quite common in the classified world. You have then the special access programs. You got then the unacknowledged special access and the waived unacknowledged special access programs. Waived meaning it's waived from all oversight. And then, you know, as I did more research into this, I'm sure I'm missing so much. But there are these there's something called ACCM. This is in the Navy, U.S. Navy, called Alternative or Compensatory Control Measures. What is that? Well, it turns out that this is, at least was recently, the Navy version of black budget. In fact, the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, I think around 2005, made the statement publicly to the effect that he said, these things are springing up like mushrooms and I can't control them, much less Congress. He said, I don't really know. But essentially what they were deeply secret Navy programs for who knows what. Who knows what? And where do they get their money from? Well, not all from taxpayer money, obviously. There's a lot of illegal funds washing through the national currencies around the world. Narcotic trafficking, obviously. Illegal gun running and financial fraud, securities fraud, and so forth. This is endemic. If you ever really want a little more information on this, I recommend you read a really great classic modern piece by one of my friends and heroes, Catherine Austin Fitz. I really like Catherine. She was number 2 at a major department under the George Bush Senior administration, Housing and Urban Development. She's a financial whiz, and her own conclusion, incidentally, was that about 85 or maybe up to 90% of the U.S. federal government is literally unauditable. Like, I don't know, maybe God himself could not audit the U.S. government because it's just not possible to do so. It's not possible. It's designed that way. And it's her contention that tremendous amount of illegal money washes through the branches of the U.S. government in money laundering operations and the like. And think of it this way, of course. If you are an agency and you need to raise secret armies, subvert elections, kill people clandestinely, and so forth, it helps, doesn't it, to have your own secret stash of unvouchered cash? Yeah, sure it does. Everyone wants that money. But beyond the ACCM and the like, we have what I would call private contractors, private cliques. I spoke to one person involved in these types of shenanigans and said, look, you know, you don't sign your papers at this stage. There's no documentation for any of this stuff. It's like the mafia or any other organized crime syndicate. When you're in, you know, never reveal anything or bad things will happen to you and the people you love. They don't need to sign these security documents. It's passé. And, of course, we have this nebulous world of quasi-public, quasi-private entities. What are they? Well, they're beyond the classification system. And, in fact, I would suggest that this is really the seat of the human nexus of power in the UFO field. But then beyond that, you know, then there's these other guys, these other beings, these entities, whatever they are, them, I call them sometimes. So that's the secrecy iceberg. And just to give you an idea of where some of those other documents I showed you lie within the secrecy spectrum. Well, the Twining memo, which I mentioned to you earlier, that was secret at the time. So that was a little bit below the surface, where he says these are real, not visionary or fictitious. You have I didn't mention this earlier, but a very good memo from 1949, FBI, in which it described the flying saucer to be a top secret classification within the military. Well, that memo itself was confidential. The 1952 Chadwell memo, which I referred to earlier, that also was secret. A 1959 memo about airspace violations over Oak Ridge nuclear facility, confidential, just below the surface. One dealing with the UFO sighting by an American senator when he was in the Soviet Union, that was confidential. The memo that described the disabling of American nuclear missiles at Malmstrom Air Force Base, when there was a huge UFO directly above, that was secret. And so on. So you get the idea that, the documents that we do have, while valuable, very valuable, only go part of the way anyway. There's a world of secrecy well beyond. And the real irony, well, not the irony, but the real disappointing aspect of that is even those types of documents now, those levels of classification, are very difficult to get any longer. So we've got all the missing money. Probably another thing we've all heard about at one point or another. Where does all this money go? Well, you talk about the black budget. I continually just shrug my shoulders, and sometimes in a better mood I'll just smile when I read these articles describing how large the U.S. black budget is. So that is the budget of classified spending. Okay, so the New York Times back in 2008 estimated that it was $32 billion. Just to put this in perspective. All right, the U.S. Pentagon's black budget in 1990 was estimated to be almost exactly the same, about $30 billion, in an era pre-9/11. And it's about the same, according to the New York Times, in 2008. I don't think so. Wired magazine about a year later said it was about $50 billion. Well, it's getting a little warmer, Doc, but still not quite there, I think. So, yeah, that's what that deserves. Then you hear about trillions of dollars. I've talked about this a number of times. I've tried wrapping my brain around it. I think I'm getting there. Famously, Donald Rumsfeld, and he was not the first person to talk about trillions of dollars, by the way, that gone missing. What he said, this is when the Bush administration was brand new. They really had nothing to lose here. You can blame it all on the Clinton years. And what he said to the House Armed Services Committee in July of 2001, a month and a half before 9/11, we're talking about budget allocations for the next fiscal year. The Pentagon's budget in fiscal year 01 was about $310 billion. And here's Rumsfeld saying, well, our accounting systems are completely snarled up. He said, according to our latest estimate, we cannot account for, he said, $2.6 trillion in transactions, he said. And then he added, if that's believable. Now he's talking to the members of Congress. And then that was amended to 2.3 trillion. So normal people listening to this would have a big moment where they go, say what? How can you lose track of 8 times your annual budget? Well, I think, not being an accountant, I've tried understanding this. And what I've come to understand is that, well, it's not that they lost all that money. And I don't see how they really could have lost all that money. Why would Rumsfeld actually say such a thing? But these are reconciliation problems. There's something like 500 or more different computerized accounting systems within the Pentagon at that time. It was an absolute mess. And so what they later claimed, this is the part that I really find funny. About a year later, they said, well, we got that number down. We've reconciled it down to about only $500 billion, so getting better. But then where they lose me is a few years after that, the Pentagon actually said they got that number down to 0. And as I commented once before, I liken that to a school kid, who is a perennial F student. Fails every class, and fails math yet again, and comes home to mom and dad, and changes his report card from an F not to a D or a C, but to an A, that's what we call getting greedy. If you're going to lie, why not do it a little more plausibly than say, yeah, we've resolved $2.6 trillion in transactions. But of course, obviously, someone high up in the Pentagon said, I want that number down to 0, and that's what you're going to do. But not just within the Pentagon do we find all of these financial shenanigans going on. This is an article from 2006. Discrepancies in America's accounts hide a black hole. And I'll just read a little bit here. The global financial system seems to have a black hole at its center. Over the last 2 decades, U.S. residents have sold a total of about $5.5 trillion worth of IOUs to foreigners, yet the officially recorded net investment position of the U.S. has deteriorated only by a little more than half this amount. The U.S. capital market seems to have acted like a black hole for investors from the rest of the world, in which $2.7 trillion vanished from sight, or at least from official statistics. How can such $2.7 trillion disappear? Good question. I don't have all these answers. But clearly what we have is a situation where we've got massive financial fraud taking place. Go back through recent history of intelligence community manipulation of banks. Remember BCCI from about 20 years ago. It was a pretty nasty bit of business in which we had a lot of intelligence community money laundering of major financial institutions. This type of thing happens, I think, quite frequently.
You're listening to the Power Chords Music Network, and this is PowerTank. Stay tuned. We will continue with tonight's presentation in a moment.
Rebel souls, deserters we've been called.
Hey listeners, this is Shred from the Power Chords Music Network. One of the most revolutionary movements to have ever affected Western society was the rock and roll revolution of the 60s and 70s. The grandfathers and grandmamas of hard rock and heavy metal never worried about political correctness. It was their mission to upend the system and talk about the things that we aren't supposed to talk about. Get yourself back in touch with that inner rebel and rock out with me to the latest and greatest in hard rock and heavy metal. Spanning 5 decades of the genre, I'm always digging up the gems, exposing you to new bands, and throwing out the news and information you didn't even know you wanted to know.
Bad company, I can't deny. Bad company.
Tune in with me on Power Chords, bringing in the weekends and turning the midnight hours. Nothing but music, nothing but rock.
Until the day I die. Until the day I die.
Power Chords. Digital metal.
A human head weighs 8 pounds.
The sun, giver of all life. The Mayans worshiped the sun. Then they disappeared without a trace. Don't let this happen to you. The fact is, if you spend time in the sun, you're almost certain to die. All leading medical practitioners have determined sun exposure causes cancer and heartburn.
I'm an expert. Going in the sun is as dangerous as smoking or living too near a nuclear power station.
Oh no, not chemo again.
No, never again with tropicarcinoma.
Keep out the sun's dangerous rays with tropicarcinoma. It's a unique blend of coconut oil, zinc, aluminum, boron, magnesium, and other volatile metals to neutralize the sun's rays and form a chemical shield. It's just great for the skin and the IQ. Tropicarcinoma.
I'm a lifeguard and I love tropicarcinoma. I even coat my eyeballs and digestive tract. I'm white as a sheet and shooting blanks. I feel great about myself, and that's important.
A friend of mine asked me, why spend time in the sun if it's dangerous and you don't want to tan? And I just laugh and try not to think about it.
Tropicarcinoma. Give the sun a challenge.
So all of this, really all that I've given you up to this point is simply prologue. Now let's talk about what I like to call breaking away. Let's pretend, okay, that we, everyone in this room, is in a classified black budget program, and in fact, we are charged with studying ET technology. That has come to us. All right. So what happens when you have we have total deep secrecy? We have Everyone here has got an IQ of over 150, 160, 170, and we've, working on this, 200, some absolute geniuses to study this. And we've got this recovered ET technology. And essentially, for all intents and purposes, an infinite amount of money to play with, and a long period of time to do it. What happens then? Do we have a breakthrough in which, one of us, let me go back here, I'll come up to that in just a minute. Do we have a breakthrough in which we have a eureka moment, right? Where we might have the idea to improve our integrated circuits or come up with fiber optics or high tensile fibers, as Philip Corso claimed, or any number of other breakthroughs that would be real money makers for us. Well, sure, I think that would probably be the case. And of course, having such a goose that lays golden eggs in this acquired technology, our incentive, by the way, for giving it to the rest of the world goes down to zero, less than zero. But what if, on top of that, we have other breakthroughs? We discover the form of energy that these craft use, and it's not petroleum. Maybe hot fusion or cold fusion, I don't know, zero-point energy, something more exotic still? Sure. And what if we discovered that? Well, maybe our bosses would say, you're not going to be sharing that with the rest of the world, thank you very much, because that would take down the petroleum industry. Probably the largest industry in the world. If not the largest, it's right up there. Latest estimate I read is that it was the number one. So, no, we wouldn't be allowed to do that. Or other developments, I don't know, super longevity, some biotech development. Why wouldn't that be possible? Developments in computing, advanced or strong AI. Maybe even quantum computing. I read a piece about a week or two ago on some new breakthroughs in the public realm on quantum computing. What if they made a breakthrough before that? See, the way science goes is it doesn't just move at a linear rate, of course, right? It builds on itself. It can go in an exponential manner. One breakthrough can lead to another, which can lead to another. So the next thing you know, our little group, after 30 years, well, we might be into some pretty wild stuff. Very wild stuff. So let's talk about that. What I call a breakaway civilization. In a moment I'll tell you exactly why I call it a breakaway civilization. But such a group really could easily be considered as something of an invisible empire. Technology vastly better than that of the mainstream world. And I'll just share another anecdote with you. A scientist that I spoke with who worked at the NSA back in the mid-60s, around 1965, told me that at that time NSA computers had a clock speed of roughly 650 megahertz, which of course today is nothing, but which the rest of the world had not caught up to until around the year 2000, so 35 years later. So on that basis, you might say NSA was about 35 years ahead of most of the rest of the world. Not too bad. All right, so what might our group, if we have truly exotic technology to study, where might we be? It's a good question to ask. We would have the ability to explore areas of our world that would be unavailable to the rest of them, obviously. Because we might have the ability to go off-world, right? Or we might have the ability, to go below the surface of the earth in ways that ordinary people can't do. So we'd have the ability then to interact with, possibly, have encounters with maybe some of these beings who are involved in the UFO phenomenon, or behind it. We just might. And which would give us deeper scientific and cosmological understandings, different framework in which we think, and probably, I would say almost definitely, a significant built infrastructure. Look below your feet for that one. That might very well be off the grid in key ways. As a historian, one of my favorite writers is kind of forgotten these days, but he's the meta-historian, Arnold J. Toynbee. I like Toynbee. Some historians love to kind of knock him down a peg. As a meta-historian, that means you study the history of civilizations, and as a generalist like that, specialists in various fields can kind of pick holes in the things that you say. But Toynbee was one of these guys, who's an absolute genius, who was able to see the big picture and in an awful lot of detail in the little pictures as well. And, reading Toynbee years ago really got me thinking about what a civilization was. He claimed he identified a variety of certain separate, distinct human civilizations that have appeared over, our history. And so I thought, what is a civilization really? It's kind of hard to define, I would say, but there's certain things that you'd look to. You'd look to the level of technology that these people have. You'd look to their, as I mentioned earlier, cosmology. Their idea, that is, of where we fit in the world, in the universe. What's it all about? They might be defined by their social interactions, how they interact with each other and other worlds and other civilizations and so on. And if you look at it that way, I would say that our hypothetical little group here could very well be considered a separate civilization in many key ways. One that has broken away from the mainstream one, hence a breakaway civilization. And that's the basic concept that I've been working with that I think has happened. And it's not that they would always live in what you might call an alternative 3 scenario, if you're familiar with alternative 3. In other words, going off-world and never interacting with the rest of us ever again. I don't quite think that's the case. What I think is that they have a great deal of latitude, a great deal of independence, that the civilization itself is largely independent, but I'm not quite sure that the members of that are totally independent from us. I think they have family. They've got mothers and fathers, and they would have to come back. And I think this is in fact the case. I would suspect that it causes a great deal of personal stress on many of those members living in it, but that's just my supposition. Ultimately, they would have a great deal of independence from the established system. I really enjoyed hearing the concepts of Peter Levenda when he talks about how separate some of these, the Nazi group after the Second World War seems to have become. And I think that factors into all of this. What we're talking about is substantial financial power, ultimately, that is able to dictate terms to governments. And that's what it's always about. It's about money. Money talks, everything else walks. So that's the idea of a breakaway civilization, but then we're obligated to ask ourselves, well, what are they doing? What are they studying? I think they're studying and doing a few things. One, I think, is making their own UFOs, obviously. Clearly what you'd want to do if you acquire this technology is you want to study it and you'd want to replicate it. Seems to me, I would say no later than the 60s, but could it be as early as the 50s? Maybe even in the 40s they were making these things that were actually functional. And along these lines, let me just say I do have a bit of a problem with, although I've come to be very sympathetic to the concept of a post-World War II Nazi-based UFO technology. Yes, I think that that's a very important part of this picture. I'm yet not really persuaded, not at all, that that's the full picture. We've got a lot of different groups, I'll get a little more into this, that are involved here, and I don't believe that all of them are us. So I think that some of us acquired things that belong to some of them being non-humans, and that we've been trying to make these things. So making UFOs, and then studying the bodies, conducting biotech research, I think is another important part of this program. Another one, which I'll get into a moment from now, is developing a secret space program. Clearly, you would need to do that. You'd need to have a clandestine program to explore, to whatever extent possible, the region around your world without the public knowing about it. The program's also about theft, basically, about using free money to conduct the research and to provide the security. That is, your tax dollars and mine. It's also about profiting from this. It's a money-making venture from the acquired technology, segueing it into patents and economic financial opportunities. It's also about hiding itself from most of U.S. and Allied military structures, while using them, however, as their security force, their own personal security system. It's a really nifty scenario when you think about it from their point of view. And also, let's never forget maybe the most important thing. It's about dealing in whatever fashion they can with the presence of these others, these other beings, and their interaction with humanity and with planet Earth in whatever fashion that happens to be. Yes, they have to deal with that too. So, now let me move into space, what I'll call oddities. And this really, traditionally, isn't my domain. Really, it's Richard Hoagland's domain. Remember when he used to do Mars research? I remember that, those days. I appreciate the 9/11 research, Richard, very much. It was excellent. In fact, while I'm thinking of it, I would like to just comment that the exposition on Dr. Judy Wood was superb, absolutely superb. And I really appreciated the discussion on torsion physics, something that, I'm sure many of us have heard of, but really something that was not as clear to me as it was at the end of that lecture. Now, when I deal with space, I actually feel very constrained because I'm really not the expert here. Richard is the expert. But I don't need to be the expert for what I'm trying to say here. All right? So what I want to do is discuss what I think is very good evidence for the fact that there are things beyond the atmosphere of this planet that are not supposed to be, and that their very existence would demand the creation of a secret space program, if nothing else than to investigate. Okay? So let's look at that. Now this is a video clip. Let me make sure that I've got the sound on. I do. Some of you are very familiar with this. This is only 2 minutes. It's worth our time. This is the testimony of a former U.S. Air Force Sergeant Carl Wolf, and this is from the, I guess let's call it the legendary Disclosure Conference organized by Dr. Stephen Greer back in May 2001. Heck of an event, I have to say. I wish I were there. I was a brand newbie in the UFO field at that time, following this avidly, and listen to what Carl Wolf says about the moon. Oh, wait. Hold on. Do we have audio for this? We do not? Oh, I'll put it to my mic, yeah. Awesome. Crank it up.
My name is Carl Wolf, and I was a precision electronics photographic repairman with a top secret crypto clearance in the United States Air Force. I was stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. In 1965, in mid-1965, I was loaned to the Lunar Orbiter Project at NASA on Langley Field. Dr. Colley was in charge of that project. They had problems with a piece of electronic equipment that was bottlenecking their production of photographs. I went to the facility, and when I walked into the facility, there were scientists from all over the world. I was stunned, actually, to see people at a NASA project from all over the world. It didn't make any sense to me initially. I was taken into the laboratory where the equipment was malfunctioning. I couldn't repair it in the dark. I asked to have it removed. Airman second class was in the dark room at that time. I was also an airman second class. I was interested in how the whole process functioned, how the data got from the lunar orbiter to the laboratory. I asked the young man if he described the process to me. He did. About 30 minutes into the process, he said to me, in a very distressed way, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And then he proceeded to put photographs down in front of me, and clearly in these photographs were structures, mushroom-shaped buildings, spherical buildings, and towers. And at that point, I was very concerned because I knew we were working in compartmentalized security. He had breached security, and I was actually frightened at that moment. And I did not question him any further. And a few moments later, someone did come into the room. I worked there for 3 more days, and I remember going home and naively thinking, I can't wait to hear about this on the evening news. And here it is, more than 30 years later, and I hope we hear about it tonight. And I will testify under oath before Congress.
Yeah, pretty neat. Oh boy, I'm not too good with I've just blown the microphone off the... Thank you. Thank you. So sorry. I broke it. I broke it. It's what I do. There we go. Okay, excellent. Can you hook me up there? I felt like the helpless damsel in distress. Thank you very much. Then we have some other statements. Can you hear me all right here? Is this good? All right, good. Clark McClelland. I've spoken with Clark a number of times also. He had many, many years working at Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. This is a statement he put on abovetopsecret.com. If you go to ATS, I visit it pretty frequently. He just writes here, I worked at Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center from 1958 to 1992. There are many mysteries that have been discovered during the years that we have been exploring the moon, sun, and planets. The former CEO of Lockheed Skunk Works was visiting the Cape many years ago. I asked him a question. This is Ben Rich. Ben Rich said, Clark, black budget dollars have taken the USA military at least 50 plus years beyond the present understanding of the general public and how far we are technologically advanced. You have no idea where we have gone out there. I said, Mars, sir? He looked at me and his head movement said yes. Are there monuments on the moon, Mars, etc.? Bet on it. Again, that's a thread from Above Top Secret. You've got the link right there. You can find that, no problem. And then we have the story of Gary McKinnon. In a nutshell, his case is still, it drags on. This has been almost a full decade. And this man's life has been in limbo since he was arrested in November of 2002. And essentially, Gary McKinnon was looking for proof of UFOs and of the cover-up. To call him a hacker is really not accurate, but he was peeking to the extent that he could into various U.S. defense websites looking for evidence of a UFO cover-up. And what he found on the U.S. Space Command site around November of 2000, he found a list of what he said were officer names under the heading non-terrestrial officers. He also found a list of what were called fleet-to-fleet transfers, which had a list of ship names. None of those names were correspondent to any U.S. Navy ships. Couldn't remember the names, unfortunately. Then was arrested in 2 years after that, in 2002. And to this day, he's in danger of extradition. His fate is not resolved. What's interesting, by the way, as an aside about the McKinnon case, if you study the media coverage, the reportage of his saga, in the early years, the UFO angle was very, very prominently displayed. This guy looking for the UFO cover-up finds XYZ, is arrested, wow. Look up the McKinnon case and track the coverage in subsequent years. And the longer we go into this, the UFO thing, if it even appears anywhere, it's at the bottom, tucked away. And now he's simply called by the Pentagon the greatest Pentagon hacker in history, which is a load of rubbish. Absolute rubbish. But this is, so in other words, the whole UFO angle has been very, very subtly siphoned out of the story, and that's what it's all about. And the fact is, I think Gary McKinnon did find evidence of a secret space program. That's, I think, the single most logical conclusion. Then we have some photographic anomalies. Again, this is Richard Hoagland's territory, not truly mine, but hey, I'm allowed to look at these pictures too. And also, I mean, I would just say I don't want to just blah blah you to death here. I try to read what people and analysts have to say about it. I'm not a physicist at all. I'm not a true photographic analyst. I know how to look at some pictures a little bit, but that doesn't make me an expert. But this is a very famous photograph. It's called the Shard, and in the background, the tower. In fact, Richard's talked about this on COSA, I think, a number of times. All he can say is that this object in the foreground, the Shard, is estimated to be about 1.5 miles high, about 2 kilometers. And the blur, or the tower behind it, about 7 miles, 10 kilometers or more high. I would say that this qualifies as pretty darn interesting indeed. I would like for there to be follow-up confirming evidence from other photographic sources, and maybe they exist. I'm not aware of them. Nonetheless, they're interesting. They're very interesting. And if I were running a clandestine program, I could bet you that I would be very interested in following up with covert missions to look into that. Absolutely I would. Absolutely I would. And there are these other things. Again, this is one that John Lear, again, chatted. I was talking with Richard, I think, about this the other day. I think I was talking with Richard about this. The evidence that John Lear is convinced looks like strip mining on the moon. I have to say the photograph does look something like strip mining. I wouldn't say it's going on today. I don't. If you compare it with photographs of actual strip mining operations, like, say, this one, this is a lot more involved. I think I'm not really convinced that that is a strip mining operation, but it does, have a kind of at least superficial similarity, and you could say this is worthy of a follow-up investigation. And once again, if I were gifted with such exotic technology that allowed me to go off-world, yes, I would absolutely be looking into that. I would find that to be of enough interest to justify it. And then we have the monolith on Phobos. There's a picture of Phobos, the irregular moon of Mars, one of them. Only recently discovered, as far as I know. It's fascinating to me. Absolutely. Look at that. That's a monolith to your top right. That thing is shaved off. It looks pretty darn squared off to me. That does not look like a natural object. Not at all. When Buzz Aldrin talked about it, you got to wonder what's inside the Buzz Aldrin's head. I'm sure all of us in this room would love to have an open, honest, quiet conversation with this man. Because he seems to be making these various statements that just are right out there. About being followed on the way to the moon. Well, that's pretty darn interesting. And then he makes a comment on this. But of course, every time he makes a statement, then he runs away from it. Edgar Mitchell, incidentally, I mentioned his statements previously about his high-level connections relating to ET bodies and technology. He also, I have to say, has really run away from those statements. And he made several of them very explicit. But now you get Edgar Mitchell to talk about this, and he's much more, he holds back. And he offers his opinion and much more nebulous statements about the reality of this all and how he's convinced that it's real. But he doesn't talk the way he used to. He doesn't make these statements. Same with Buzz Aldrin. So the Phobos monolith, good God, that's a fascinating thing. And I would say at this point, I don't know how else to characterize that except as an evidence of artificiality. That's my own non-scientific opinion. And then, of course, we have Mars. And I am in no way going to give you an extended discourse on this, except that I would say that I also feel that what we have is you've got formations that do not look natural. Not to Mr. Hoagland, not to a lot of other scientists, and certainly not to myself. And so, whether they're ancient, which I would suspect they are, or whether they're more recent, whatever. That's a secondary issue, in my opinion. The bottom line is that these look darn strange, and they don't look to me like they're supposed to be there. So, again, you have evidence of at least a strong motivation for us to breakaway civilization to go off-world and investigate. Is it like in Kubrick's movie 2001 Space Odyssey where you've got the monolith on the moon? Is it something that going there we would discover some great secret? Well, yeah, maybe. You wouldn't want the world to know about it, though, because, there goes your secrecy. The whole thing comes unglued. And again, I'll be coming back to that in a moment. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about a guy who I really think has not gotten enough attention that I feel he deserves. Jeff Challenger, he's no longer alive. He died in October 2007. I met Jeff one time. He lived in Sacramento, California. As you'll see in this news article, story about him, he was paralyzed. He had a spinal injury, and so spent really his adult life lying prone, and he devoted himself to downloading NASA links of NASA missions. and also those of the European Space Agency and Russia toward the end there. And just looking at them and studying them and looking for strange things. And guess what? He found a lot of strange things. Other people have done this, but Jeff did a lot of work on it. As a personal note, I will just tell you this very odd story. It's totally true. Now, I'd been familiar with Jeff's work for some time. His website was called Project Prove. And I don't remember exactly when I became acquainted with him, around maybe 03, 04. And I was a fan right from the get-go. But in the fall of 07, I don't really know why, but I became absolutely obsessed by this man's website. I was telling everyone, you've got to look at Challenger's site. This is an amazing site. It's great. ProjectProve.com. Go there, go there, go there. I was talking about his work at various conferences. I was really talking Jeff up. And in early October 07, I was in France. I was talking to some people there about Jeff. I said, this guy has got some amazing stuff. And on a whim, I thought, I really want to do a download of his entire site. So I did a rip of his site on a super slow internet connection. It took hours. But I did it. I did the whole site. And the next day, I got an email that told me Jeff Challenger had died. And I thought, wow, what are the odds? I will go to my dying day convinced that there is something very, very unconventional happening in terms of our reality that had me focusing on that man at that time. I don't know what it was, but I was absolutely, utterly obsessed with his work. And then he died, and I had his website. And shortly after that, his website went offline, and it was gone forever. I happened to have, as far as I can tell, in the public domain, the only copy of his site, and I asked his widow permission a little while after that if I could put his site up attached to my own, and I now have it up there. So I have Jeff's website attached to keyholepublishing.com, and I would encourage you to go through it. You could spend a lot of time, months, going through it. You wouldn't be done. This is a 2-minute clip of a local news article from California about Jeff, and then I want to show you some of the anomalies that he captured and put forward.
Notice Sacramento man tonight has his eyes on the skies, looking for objects that may be out of this world.
What he's found so far will get you thinking about life on other planets. Tony Lopez in the newsroom with incredible pictures.
Well, they really are. You know, when we see a big, bright object that lights up the night sky, chances are it's the big, bright moon, right? But what if that object is moving? And what if that object can't be explained?
Almost a blur. Went under the plane and pulled out in front.
Don't call the guy with a pack of cigs and a battery crazy or lazy. A spinal injury means Jeff Challenger spends most of his time in bed. What he sees from his perch is out of this world.
Oh, that looks good.
Jeff records and studies images from the NASA television channel. Most of it's been uneventful. Most of it.
Ran across something that just, whoa, what was that?
That was this, the bright object, ripping through space.
And I ran the tape back a little bit, watched it again, and I'm hollering down the hall, hey, honey, you gotta come see this.
The object caught on tape did not come from, say, the camcorder of a UFO enthusiast, but from NASA during the Shuttle Atlantis mission in September of 2000. Since 1999, Jeff figures he's seen at least 100 of what he calls anomalous events, a fancy way of saying UFOs. Here's another one, recorded during the recent Discovery mission, and yet another.
They're not an ice chip, they're not a piece of debris, it's not the moon, it's not a star, not another spacecraft, not a satellite.
This is what a real ice chip looks like, Jeff claims. Not nearly as bright as the unidentified object, and you can see the ice chip turn. Tonight you can hear the critics. He wants it clear, though. He just spots anomalies in space. It's not time, he says, to welcome the little green men, but he will keep looking out for anything that can't be explained.
From one mission to another, you never know what you're going to find.
So Jeff Challenger, who died October 4th, 2007. What I'd like to do is show you a couple of... Oh, man, I did it again. We're good. We've got it going on here. I shouldn't be allowed to touch. There we go. Okay. So this was the clip that they just showed, and Again, I'll just let you see it a little bit better on a big screen. This is from 1999, STS-96, June 3rd. And you can see in a moment this pulsing bright object going, woo, there it goes. And pulsing very regularly. And there's the ice chip. So, very interesting indeed. This is a clip from the same mission, same day, over Florida. This goes for about a minute. Now, you're going to see a lot of thunderstorms in the center. This is very common. People who've never seen this before think, oh my God, there's a war going on. It's thunderstorms. They're happening all over the world. But what you want to look at are these objects on your top right, moving very oddly. And then he's got highlighted a number of other oddities in Earth orbit. And these are all, of course, looking down at Earth from the space shuttle. The guy running determining who sees what on the NASA TV is called the IMCO, and that person can control, if they think it gets a little too crazy, often they'll black it out like this, but then they, lighten it up. One thing Jeff pointed out is that on the NASA station, there's a tremendous amount of what seemed to be intentional interference to degrade the quality of the video. And I think he made some sense on that. There are these two objects and others. Some of them are hard to see, and the resolution here isn't quite the best. But you can see that there are things moving around that beg an explanation. This one's almost done. Probably let this one go on a little longer than necessary, but I think it's just about done. Let's move on. Now this is actually quite interesting. Same mission next day. Still STS-96, 1999. What you're going to see is a very fast streaking object. It's going to go diagonally from the top, your top left down to the bottom right. Very quick. You'll see it more than once. And then what you'll see is another object going in the same direction, and it will slow down toward the end. You'll see it happen. So let's take a look here. Keep your eye. There it goes, the bright, fast, and that's the other one. You can see it slowing down. That's a city below. We're going to see it again. That object slowed down. Here it is again at reduced speed. Now, I don't know of any dust particle that can slow down, or any craft in space that can change direction or slow down like that. Here's something, I don't know if it's the firing of a weapon, but you're going to see two objects moving at a perpendicular way. So one's going to come straight up from below, and the other one is going to miss it, but not by much, going in a horizontal manner. This is near the city of New Orleans. So here it is, going straight up, and then the other object going across. Right angles to each other. And we'll show this at slower speed. Here it is, slower. Can you see that all? You can see that a little bit. Not the clearest, but okay. Let's move ahead. Another one, this is from 2000, STS-106. Now this is a fascinating one because you will see a definite triangular formation in motion. The sun had not risen at this point, so there's, you can't blame it on reflectivity. These objects, as you will see, are in formation, but they're not in a locked formation. They maneuver within small parameters. There is a U.S. Navy satellite called the NOS. This is a trio of satellites that orbit, but their orbit is higher, much higher than that of the space shuttle. So you wouldn't see them below. So let's take a look. You're going to see this in two different ways. So first, with the objects highlighted. And you can see also how they sort of maneuver slightly within their circle. So it's not an exact maneuvering, but they are in a formation. And now I'm going to show you, this is 50% speeded up without any highlighting, but now that you know what to look for, I bet you that you'll have an easy time seeing this, even though it's faster. Here it goes. There they are. I'll do it again for you so you can see. It's kind of in double time. So here it is again. The top one seems to be flashing a little bit more. But they're definitely in motion. There's 4 of them, but they're in a kind of a triangular pattern. What are these? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. And here's another one. Same mission, STS-106, September 2000. This is over the city of Chicago. Now here, this is fascinating, because this is going to, you have an audio clip of the NASA commentator. And he is absolutely at a loss of how to describe that bright thing in the center. That's what you're going to be looking at. And it's actually pretty humorous. So here we go.
Atlantis is approaching sunrise as it approaches the Great Lakes area. This a view of Chicago, and also some ice crystals or other items being illuminated by the rising sun. Atlantis moving into sunrise. In just about the next minute or so, as that occurs, ice crystals or water that's been dumped overboard from the shuttle is always illuminated in the close vicinity of the spacecraft. Again, that view of Chicago, though, and the shore of Lake Michigan.
Yeah, let's talk about Chicago. Isn't that awesome from this space? A couple of things. First of all, the sun had not yet risen, so they were not in sunlight. And he's trying to make it sound like, oh yeah, well, the sun's almost about to rise. He was obviously not saying what everyone in the world who would have looked at that would have been thinking, because obviously he couldn't. He couldn't. Now, this is actually the zoom of the same object, so you can just take another look at it. Pulsing with quite interesting regularity. And it also appears to me, anyway, that the lens is still, there we go, keeping on it. It's moving, zooming in, and that's the end of it. I have 5 minutes. Really? Uh-oh. Really? All right. I'll do my best. This is an object doing a U-turn. This is my last of the space clips. I'll show it again. Just take a look. Kind of nifty. Now here's an enhanced version of the same clip, and you can see it actually maneuvering as it goes back and forth. What is that? That's from 2005, STS, I believe, 114. So, in other words, what we have is, I think, not a bad case at all for some space anomalies. And again, as I've been saying, a very strong case for a secret space program. So what is the ultimate scenario that I'm envisioning? Very similar, actually, to what Richard Hoagland was saying in his talk just previous. I think what we have is maybe a not-so-secret Cold War going on. It's taking place in a clandestine manner, but there's something happening. My own assessment, I haven't really told you why, and maybe at another time I will, but my assessment of it is that there are multiple groups interested in us and our world. After all, I do think that we're quite fascinating. We're on a technological trajectory that's about to place us into their world, let's face it. It's only been a century since we had a non-techno society of horses and wood. Now we're into advanced computing, probably soon AI, nanotech, and the rest. Are we being quarantined? I would say the answer is probably. That's what it seems like to me. I also think, though, that there's not just one human group with one agenda that's in this breakaway civilization that I talk about. My suspicion is that we're talking about competing groups. And they compete with each other for technology and for information. So in other words, a very rich, detailed reality that is being hidden from us. But it won't be hidden forever. Why? Because rapid change in our world is the rule, not the exception. That's the French Revolution. You realize in 1787, even 88, France was in some financial trouble, sure, but who expected that within a couple of years the king and queen would have their heads removed from their bodies, the monarchy, centuries old, would be abolished, and a republic declared? No one knew that. Nobody predicted that. The Russian Revolution, ditto. At the beginning of 1917, hey, the Tsar had been on a dynasty that existed for 3 centuries. The Berlin Wall, the end of communism, all of us lived through that. Happened like lightning. People don't expect these. And we have it today. You have it in Tunisia. You have it in Egypt. You have it in Libya. You have it everywhere in the Middle East now. It's not going to go away. And the fact is that just a few months earlier, who here really would have predicted it? Change, in other words, dramatic change happens fast. Change is inevitable. This is what we looked like about 300 years ago. And we had looked more or less like this. We'd lived more or less like this for quite a while. But then we got science. And now look where we're at. What's our world going to look like in another 20 years? I don't think any of us can easily predict this. What new technologies, what new capabilities will we have that will enable us as a society to crack this wide open without the help of the powers that be, without the help of these other beings? Because one thing, again, I want to harken back to what Richard said. It's been my own opinion for quite some time. The true dynamic in the equation here isn't these other beings, and it's not the power secret keepers. It is us. We are the dynamic. And that's because we are changing so rapidly. Primarily and most observably, I would say, in our technology. But our ideas, our mind is changing. And it is happening around the world. And so we're not going to look like this even in another 20 years. Think back to 20 years ago, 1991. Our world was totally different. So when this secret is opened up, it's going to be forced out, whether it's through a new variation of WikiLeaks of the future, or through new technologies that will enable us collectively to capture, record, and communicate this in some new, unforeseen way. Because I think we'd be fools to say that the world of 2011 is just going to stay like this forever. Obviously it won't. When that happens, man, it's going to be a difficult week, won't it? We're going to be asking a lot of questions. Who are they? What are they? People will not be feeling too at ease, I can guarantee you. I don't think I'll be feeling at ease, and I've been waiting for this. I think we'll all have to take several deep breaths. What do they want? What is their agenda? These are going to be front row center, obviously, for the whole world. How has this secret been kept? There's a question. It opens up a whole can of worms dealing with the power structure of our world. How has the academic community been managed? The scientific community, the political media? Where have these guys been? And what is their relationship to the global intelligence community? Clearly that's going to be a very important question, because that's where the answer to that question lies. And then, of course, some of the things that I've been hinting at here. What's the status of our secret tech programs? Where are we at? Do we have flying saucers? Do we go off-world? That will open up the existence of this breakaway group that I've talked about. Now, skeptical scientists around the world, well, they're not just skeptical, they're openly hostile to this reality. So they're going to demand proof. I wouldn't want to be the world leader charged with breaking this news. You're going to have a lot of difficult issues to deal with. And then, what do we do? Probably the most fundamental question. What do we do about it? That's going to require leadership. It's going to require great vision and courage on the part of those people who are charged with the leadership of this planet of ours. Energy. To just open up one difficult issue. Because look, energy is one of the core issues behind the secrecy to begin with. Whatever these things used to get around, it's not petroleum. The petroleum industry, being probably the largest industry in our world, will become, poof, there it goes. For the most part. It's gone. Now that's a great thing for us, because we all know we can't exist on petroleum forever. It's just not going to work. But in the short term, you can bet it's going to be difficult to transition, especially for those groups that have invested trillions of euros, trillions of dollars into that infrastructure. Suddenly that infrastructure becomes much less valuable. So what is this new power source? Whatever it is, we will learn it. If it's the President of the United States, for instance, that makes this admission, how long do we really think it's going to take before the mainstream scientific community, after their initial shock and spending a week running around pulling their hair out of their heads, they come down and then they figure this out. They'll know that there are answers. They will know there are answers, and they will find those answers. And whatever it is, we're going to be using it. And how will that change our world? It's a wonderful thing, and it's kind of a difficult thing. You know, a device that can heat your home forever for cheap is wonderful, but what if it's convertible into a bomb that can blow up a country or more? It's possible. And so this is technology that we have to handle in a responsible way. Enough on that. There's so much more. And I wrote about this at some length in AD After Disclosure. Then you get geopolitical unrest. Think about the Middle East today. What's going to happen when those petroleum-producing countries suddenly will discover, hey, we don't really need your petroleum, thanks very much for the ride. The people in those nations may not be too happy with their political structure at that time. Saudi Arabia will not be able then to buy off their citizens with money, like they're doing now. What about the U.S.? We saw demonstrations of 1 million people in Tahrir Square in Egypt. Don't you think there might be a march of 1 million people or more on S4, Area 51, right, Pat? Dugway Proving Ground, Los Alamos National Labs? Maybe. I'll bet you Wackenhut Security can stop a march of 100 people, but not 1 million. Not 1 million. And don't you think that just might happen? And then opening up a new truth movement. Because once UFOs, then 9/11. JFK, underground bases, you name it, chemtrails. It's all going to be on the table. My God, what a exciting, challenging mess it's going to be. And so that, in other words, the moment of disclosure is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of the true fight for truth. Not the end. Yes. Now, any political leader, pretend you're, I don't know, Barack Obama, and it happens next week. I don't think it's going to happen next week. I'm not too favorable about all these predictions, by the way, that say, yeah, the disclosure is going to happen, whatever. It will happen, but it won't happen until they're absolutely forced, pressed to the wall to do it, and they'll only do it to control spin and to try to maintain control. But you see, that's where they are in danger of failing. Because think about it. Let's say you're the president of the U.S. or the president, head of the EU, whatever. You've been put into power by these elite groups. You're in there, so you're kind of working for them. But suddenly you're in a situation where you got like millions and millions of your constituents. They're ticked. They're angry. And you're going to have to make a choice. Who do you side with? The public or those Illuminati, these secret keepers, whoever these people are that put you into power? The elites. And it's not necessarily a given that a leader will side with those elites. He may, but he may not. He may not. One of my purposes in writing this last book is to show that it is possible for a responsible leader with a grand vision and a positive vision of our world to make the right choice. And the right choice is to side with the people to do it. Can it happen? Yes, of course it can happen. Will it happen? I don't know. But it can happen. And I am just about in conclusion, so the timing hasn't been too bad. I would leave you, though, with the fact that whatever the end result of this is, let's not please be utopians here. I personally am an idealist, but I'm not a utopian. There's certain things that I believe very strongly in. I have this crazy idea in the idea of truth. I believe in it. And truth is a real difficult friend to have. It requires a lot from you, but it's worth it. If you're sleeping in your home and your house is on fire, but you're having this great dream of sipping margaritas on the beach and someone's giving you a foot massage, well, that's a great dream, but it's a dream. Would you rather wake up, deal with the fire? Well, ultimately, we have to wake up. We have to deal with this fire. Keep in mind, our species has always dealt with catastrophe. It has always dealt with problems. People die, new people are born, and we adapt. It's really not going to be any different. We're going to have to deal with this very, very difficult situation. It's like a parent who has their first child. who is ever ready for their first child. Nobody is ever ready for their first child, but you just have it. And you deal with it. And we as a species, as a society, are going to have to deal with this. The ultimate irony of a disclosure of this is that even after 20 years or more, it's quite possible that we may not be an awful lot further along in understanding what we're dealing with. We may have a sufficient amount of knowledge to know that there's something going on. But that may be a very different thing from being able to pull all of the documents out of the classified world, being able to get these other entities, whatever they are, to interact with us in something more than the aloof fashion that they've done. So that, in other words, it's going to require work. Disclosure is never the end. It's always going to be the beginning. It's also possible, and I think it's likely, that these secret keepers, and far be it from me to defend these people, but they are very possibly scrambling themselves to try to deal with this challenge. I could very easily see it as a situation where they're so far ahead of us, this breakaway civilization, they might look at us and think, how can these people ever adapt? How can they ever deal with the awesome reality that we know? Well, I think that we can deal with it. If they can, so can we. It's all about growing up. You can't be a child forever. And we all love being children. And no one really likes to have to take on those responsibilities of adulthood. That's what adolescence is all about. But we get through it. And I do believe we will go through it in this case. So that's really it. I'd like to thank you for your time. These are my websites. Thank you very much. Thank you.